All right, we are now recording. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to Gypsy Moth and Emerald Ash Borer, Understanding Local Forest Pests. My name is Delana Arnold. I'm the Education Programs Manager for the Georgian Bay Biosphere, and I just want to say miigwech, thank you very much for joining us today. As we wait for some more people to trickle in, I'd just like to share a little bit about the Georgian Bay Biosphere. We're one of 18 UNESCO World Biospheres in Canada, and our region is ecologically unique. We have the largest freshwater archipelago, or group of islands, on Earth. The biosphere stretches 200 kilometers from the Severn River in the south to the French River in the north, and it was designated a World Biosphere in 2004. So we are a registered charity, and our administration office is in Parry Sound, Ontario. We rely on grants, partnerships, and donations to do our conservation and education work. Today's webinar is offered through a partnership with the Township of the Archipelago. Since 2014, the Township of the Archipelago has held an active partnership with the Biosphere to provide environmental programming. This has included a range of things from water quality monitoring coordination, forest health work, guided hikes, kids programming, and more recently, webinars. So we won't be sharing our screens during the presentation. So if you can't see people, don't worry, you're not supposed to. And please also note that we are recording today's session and we're going to upload it to our YouTube channel. We will be sending that link and other resources mentioned today in an email either later today or tomorrow. So I just also want to point out, I'm sure this is nobody's first webinar, but we are going to be using the Q&A tool. If you look at the tool options along the bottom of your screen, if you're using a desktop monitor, a laptop, you'll see Q&A. So please use that to submit all your questions to us, and we'll answer questions after the webinar. So it looks like most people have joined us now. So we're going to acknowledge the land before we begin. We respect and recognize the inherent rights and governance of the Anishinaabe Pre-Confederation. We acknowledge the rights of the Anishinaabe as legally recognized in the Robertson-Huron Treaty of 1850 and the Williams Treaty of 1923. Indigenous people in the area are of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi lineage. Mohawk people from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy also reside in the area and have historical connections to both southern and eastern Ontario. This region is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. So before we begin with the meat of our webinar, we're going to have a little pop quiz for fun. To do this, we've got some questions we're going to share with you, and I'm going to start with a super easy one. How did you hear about today's webinar? You can select all that apply. Did you hear it on our Facebook page or social media, maybe the Biosphere website or our newsletter that we send out once a month? Maybe another organization shared it, someone told you about it, or some other way of hearing about it. I want to click on what applies to you, and I will leave that up for 5 more seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right. Thank you for sharing that with us. The winner, as you can see, is social media. All right. So now we have maybe some more challenging questions. Margaret, if you would like to skip to the first one, I'm going to share our next question. Which of these leaves came from an ash tree? You don't have to submit a response, but we would encourage you to if you think you know the answer. And again, I'll leave this one up for about 5 more seconds. 3, 2, 1.
Okay, so I'm very impressed with the brave person who strayed against everybody else, but the majority of you are correct. The ash leaf is B. A is a sugar maple leaf, and C is a red oak leaf. So very good job, everyone.
Great. Our next question. Let's look at some insects. Margaret, if you'd like to skip ahead. Which of these is an emerald ash borer? Once again, we're very unanimous on one choice. So I'll leave it up for 5 more seconds. Great.
Perfect. So again, clearly an audience that has a basic understanding of these things. So yes, A is our emerald ash borer. Part of the hint is in the name, that emerald coloring. We'll talk more about identifying it later, but again, good job.
All right, our next question. Which of these is a gypsy moth caterpillar? This one's tougher, so we'll leave it up for maybe 7 more seconds.
And Delana, while people are voting, there's a comment in the chat if we could speak a bit louder.
Sure. Thanks, David. Okay, so I would say that's been about 7 seconds. I'm going to end this and share.
Okay, so I'm not surprised. You probably will have seen some of these caterpillars before in various forest health publications or talks or that kind of thing. So I'm impressed with those who answered B. That is the gypsy moth caterpillar. On the A is a forest tent caterpillar, and C is an eastern tent caterpillar. So you may have heard about those before, seen their photos before, so they may look familiar, but B is actually the gypsy moth caterpillar, and I'll explain exactly how you would know that later on.
Thanks, Margaret. All right. So we have only one more question. If you need to move the little question box out of the way, you can do so to see the images. It will move around on your screen. Which of these gypsy moth caterpillars has been infected by a virus? All right, so I think about 3 more seconds for this one. Answers are slowing down. All right, we'll share these results as well.
Perfect. Yeah, so I was hoping to get one that would trick a few people up because I do want to teach something in this webinar. So the answer to this one is actually C. So the inverse V that we see, the shape of the caterpillar, is suggestive that it has been infected by a virus. And I'll explain more what A means and why C is the way it is. B is actually a healthy gypsy moth caterpillar that hasn't been infected by anything.
Great. Thanks, Margaret. So that was our pop quiz portion of the webinar. I'm going to turn it over now to Margaret Scott, registered professional forester with Westwind Forest Stewardship, and she is going to lead the rest of the webinar. Over to you, Margaret. Margaret, I think you are still muted.
Perfect, thank you. Sorry about that. So as Lena said, I'm Margaret Scott. I'm a registered professional forester and with Westwind Forest Stewardship. I've been with them since 2017, and since then have been learning all about the French Severn Forest and kind of the Parry Sound region. I'm really impressed with kind of where everyone is from today. And I have to admit, I wasn't quite prepared for how far everyone would be tuning in from. So I do have a bit of information that pertains to kind of Ontario as a whole, but I have to admit, I won't quite be encompassing all the areas everyone is coming from. So I will do my best to, share all the general information, but some of the information is more region specific. So just a warning about that. But today I'm going to talk about emerald ash borer and gypsy moth, so 2 invasive pests that we have experienced locally. And I want to talk about identifying them, their impacts, and then also what can be done kind of going forward. First, I want to talk about who Westwind Forest Stewardship is. So we hold the Sustainable Forest License for the French Severn Forest. This includes Crown land. We don't do any forest management on private land or parkland. We don't do any cutting ourselves. So we're responsible for the planning, silviculture, so that includes things like planting and tending, the compliance activities. So we're ensuring that when operations are happening, they're being done sustainably and under regulations. And then, of course, reporting at the end, everyone's favorite. We were the first large public forest certified by the Forest Stewardship Council, and that was in 2002. And Westwind's a little bit different. We're set up a bit different than some of the other forests in Ontario in that we're a not-for-profit, community-based organization. So part of that community-based organization is working with our partners, doing education in the community, including this webinar, but it also involves our board of directors. So we have community members, we have Indigenous representation, as well as our industry members on our board of directors. That just makes us a little bit different from the top. Emerald ash borer, or EAB as it is often called, is an invasive beetle which has been found to attack most species of ash. It is native to East Asia, including areas in China and the Russian Far East. And it was first detected in Windsor in 2002, but it's since been found in Southern Ontario, Quebec, Thunder Bay, and Sault Ste. Marie. EAB was found near Gravenhurst and Bracebridge in 2018, then in Killbear Provincial Park in 2019. And the MNRF has also confirmed it in Port Severn, Bala, Perry Island, Perry Sound, and on Golden Beach Road west of Bracebridge. It is important to note that just the confirmation that it is here does not necessarily tell us how widespread it is at this point. So even though we have identified that there is the emerald ash borer, we don't know how big of an issue it is yet at this current time. First, let's talk about identifying ash trees. So emerald ash borer specifically targets ash trees. So it's important that you're able to identify them when looking for the borer. On mature trees, bark is tight and displays pattern of diamond-shaped ridges. So that's what you can see in the photo on the left. On young trees, bark is relatively smooth and can sometimes be a bit more difficult to identify that way. And the leaves contain 5 to 11 leaflets. So in this photo, you might think you're looking at 7 leaves, but you're actually looking at leaflets, and this whole thing is considered one leaf. So with ash, you'll see 5 to 11 leaflets, and they'll have smooth or toothed margins, which are just the tips. Leaflets are positioned opposite with one at the top, so you can see each of them has kind of a buddy that's directly across from it. When seeds are present, they're oar-shaped, like the oar of a boat, and they usually hang in clusters. Similar to the leaflets, branches and buds are considered opposite. So again, when they meet at a branch, they're going to be directly opposite each other, rather than kind of being alternate or staggered. And if some branches are missing, it may appear that not every branch is opposite, but if you kind of look at the general tree, you should usually be able to tell. And what makes this so neat is not many trees have opposite branching. So those that do include ashes, maples, dogwood, and horse chestnut. Once you've identified your ash tree, you can start looking for your emerald ash borer. So the adults have elongated bodies that are metallic green, again, the emerald ash borer, and they're about 1 to 1.5 centimeters long. So they are not big. This is a very zoomed in photo. They have black eyes and a black head. On the right, you can see the larva is a creamy white with 10 bell-shaped abdominal segments. So you can see kind of those segments running along its body. And when fully mature, they're about 3 centimeters long. And the larva goes through 4 stages before it's fully mature. Okay. The metallic green adults come out in June and July and then lay their eggs on the bark of ash trees. After the egg hatches, the larvae burrow into the inner bark and the cambial layer, and it feeds on the tissue, creating feeding galleries. So the larvae then excavates a tiny chamber that it will stay inside during the winter, and it overwinters as a larvae. Finally, it pupates or develops into an adult, and that happens in April and May before the cycle all starts again. So interestingly enough, in southwestern Ontario, this cycle is complete in 1 year. However, further north, about 30% of the population takes 2 years to complete this life cycle. And how does that impact the trees, and what should we be looking for? So these galleries that they've created girdle the tree by cutting off the flow of water and nutrients. So this may result in crown dieback. So that's just talking about the branches and the leaves of the tree. So you may see some dieback from there, and it happens from the top down. The leaves may also turn yellow or wilt, and those galleries can also cause bark cracks that are about 7 to 10 centimeters long. These are more obvious in young trees which do not have splits due to growth. So sometimes as trees get older, you'll just see natural splits. So in the younger trees, when you see those splits, it tends to be a little bit more obvious. Because woodpeckers feed on the larvae, you can also look for increased woodpecker damage. So the adult borers emerge from distinctly D-shaped holes that are about 3.5 to 4 centimeters across, 4 millimeters across, sorry. And you can actually see these in the picture up here. You can see on one of the holes in the top picture that you kind of have that flat side, and then the other side is rounded just like a D. Finally, if you notice signs of infestation and remove some of the bark from the tree, you will see the S-shaped galleries that the larvae created. So that's what you can see in the bottom picture. However, by the time the signs and symptoms of the attack are visible, trees have usually been infected for 3 to 4 years. And that's why it's so important that we try to detect emerald ash borer early. So this is actually what Muskoka Conservancy and partners started in 2015. So they set up green prism traps in ash tree canopies in high traffic areas of Muskoka. The traps are coated with kind of a glue-like substance that traps the insects, and it also contains lures to bait the emerald ash borer in. In 2018, they found 1 emerald ash borer at a site near Bracebridge and 1 at a site near Gravenhurst. And then in 2019, they found 27 at one and 2 at another site, both near Gravenhurst. So although they did not trap any near Bracebridge in 2019, it doesn't mean that they aren't present still there. It just means they didn't trap any that year. And as I mentioned earlier, MNRF has also confirmed the presence of EAB near Parry Sound, Bala, Port Severn, and west of Bracebridge. Unfortunately for this early detection program, just due to COVID in 2020, like many other things, it was put on hold, but they are hoping to start it up again in 2021. So hopefully we can learn more about where emerald ash borer is with these traps. Once there is an established EAB infestation, there are really only 2 main options for urban trees. There's an insecticide treatment or cutting down the tree. So triazine is the main insecticide being used to control EAB, and it actually comes from the neem tree. It is injected under a tree's bark and moves upwards with the flow of water and nutrients. So it's applied between May and August, and since it is a pesticide, it must be applied by a licensed professional. And that's what you can see happening there on the left. So he's injecting it into the base of the tree. Triazine can be effective at controlling EAB for up to 2 years. However, some areas do recommend that at the peak of an infestation, it's applied every year to make sure it's effective. So although this can be a great option, it is important to consider what trees are ideal for this treatment. First of all, it's important that they're in an area with EAB, or obviously this is not necessary. So the tree should have good overall health and be structurally sound to ensure that it is worth treating. The tree should also be one that is would be difficult or expensive to remove or replace, or has some kind of significant value to you. So it actually costs $5 to $6.50 per centimeter of diameter. So you can imagine that's going to get really expensive with larger trees, and it can get quite costly depending on the size of the tree and how many times you'll have to treat it. So that $5 to $6.50 is per treatment. Another option is to remove trees. And this is especially important if a tree is declining as a result of EAB and poses a risk to people or properties. If you're concerned about a tree, it is best to consult a forestry professional, such as an arborist. And depending on where you live, some municipalities have tree cutting bylaws or permits, so it's best to check on that before cutting a tree down. And once the tree is cut, it's also really important that the wood is not moved out of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency regulated area that we are in. So they created a regulated area so that emerald ash borer hopefully cannot spread outside of that area. So wood cannot be moved across that area. But this area is still quite large. So to slow the spread in general, it's just best to avoid moving wood to new locations. So you want to keep it as close to where it came from as possible. So speaking of removing trees, I kind of just wanted to highlight a local example of emerald ash borer. Killbear Provincial Park had to remove a significant number of trees last year due to an outbreak that they found in 2019. So the two main clusters were campgrounds that were 3 kilometers apart, and they estimated that they had to cut around 7,000 trees. And these were trees that could fall on a road or a campsite, and that's why they were taking them down. And although many were not necessarily hazardous at this stage, it was decided to cut them down preemptively for safety. Of course, this was all made more difficult with COVID, as with everything else, and contributed to Killbear being one of the last parks to open this year. Well, last year, sorry. So this is actually a photo I took. I went to Killbear in 2019 to look at the emerald ash borer, and you can see the borer in the center there, that green kind of speck, and then you can also see all the galleries kind of weaving in and out of each other. When we are talking about larger areas and woodlots, there are more management options. Although it might seem like you do not need to remove all ash trees. Instead, it's good to encourage diversity in your woodlot by promoting other species and potentially reducing the ash component a bit. If you are thinning your woodlot, focus on removing poor quality stems of all species, aside from those that you want to keep for wildlife. And depending on your goal for your woodlot, ash trees will actually retain timber value for a time after the initial attack of around 3 to 5 years. A forestry professional can help you make decisions that will take into account the long-term goals and sustainability of your woodlot. And again, I just want to stress, it's important to ensure that you are not moving ash wood outside of the regulated area. Okay.
Margaret, before you jump to Gypsy Moth, there's a question about emerald ash borer. It's what do the adults feed on?
That is a great question. And I'm not actually sure off the top of my head, but at the end of this presentation, I can get the answer for that and provide that to you. Yeah, some adults, as you'll find with Gypsy Moth, don't feed, but I will check what emerald ash borer feeds on as an adult. Great question, thank you. Okay. So European gypsy moth, it's also an invasive pest. It defoliates trees, and we have seen it in Parry Sound in recent years. The gypsy moth we see in our region is the European gypsy moth, which is found in many areas of Eastern Canada. The Asian gypsy moth is actually not known to occur in North America, although there have been introductions of the insects that have been detected and eradicated. So we are talking about European gypsy moth. The European gypsy moth was first introduced to North America in the 1860s in the hopes of crossbreeding it with the North American silkworm for the silk industry. Unfortunately, this didn't work, and it was accidentally introduced into the wild in Massachusetts, and it was eventually detected in Ontario for the first time in 1969. So we can thank the silk industry for some of the things that we're experiencing now. So here is a great diagram of the life cycle of the gypsy moth. I really like this because it shows kind of how much time they spend in each stage of life. Right now, the gypsy moth is in the egg stage. So you can see that at the top, and you can see it's quite a long stage. Eggs are laid in August and overwinter in this stage until April. In the spring, the eggs hatch and the larvae and caterpillars feed on the new foliage. Then they pupate into cocoons in mid to late July. And then finally, in late July and early August, the adults emerge. In order to be able to better identify the gypsy moth, I would like to discuss each of these stages independently. So the egg masses. These may have been some of the things you've seen around if you've noticed the gypsy moth. The egg masses can be found on tree trunks, bark, other hard surfaces like furniture, wood, the side of cabins. I mean, if you can think of it, the gypsy moth can lay an egg on it. So eggs are laid, as I said, eggs are laid in August, and they're tan colored and can have an almost fuzzy appearance. When egg masses overwinter, they can appear to have kind of a more cream or white coloring, so when they're less fresh. Size-wise, the egg masses are usually 2 to 8 centimeters long, but in this small area, they can contain 100 to 1,000 eggs. So this is a huge amount of gypsy moths in this small little area. In the spring, those eggs hatch into larvae or caterpillars. The caterpillars begin feeding on leaves, and they have 5 to 6 instar stages. So that just means where they're going to shed their skin and get bigger. And the later stages, when the caterpillar is more mature, can be identified, and this goes back to the trivia question, by the 5 pairs of blue dots and 6 pairs of red dots on their back. So you can see at the front of the caterpillar, you've got those 5 distinctive pairs of blue dots, and then towards the back, you've got those 6 pairs of red dots. So it's very thoughtful of the gypsy moth to have such distinctive patterns so that we can identify it. And they're about 5 to 7 centimeters long. The important thing is that this is the stage that causes defoliation. So this is a stage where they're eating the leaves and causing all those issues that we have. Next up, we have the pupae stage, or we have the cocoon. Not much to say about this. It's dark brown and has white to yellow hairs. Once the adults emerge, these are left behind. So I was on a local trail this past weekend, and I could actually see the pupae from last year's gypsy moths. Finally, we get to the adult gypsy moth. The adult moths do not feed on anything, and their only purpose is to reproduce. So they are not defoliating at this stage. As I said, it's just the caterpillars. So the female is the larger cream or white colored moth. You can see it on the right in the photo. And you can also see it as brown or black dots on the wing tips. So just at the bottom of its wings, they have these brown or black dots, along with some other darker detailing. The male, on the other hand, is a smaller brown moth. It has distinctive wave-like patterns on its wings. And interestingly enough, the female can't fly. So it sends out pheromones to attract the male who can fly for mating. And what do these guys cause? So the gypsy moth prefers oak trees, but actually has over 300 plant hosts, including maple, birch, white pine, and white spruce. And a single caterpillar can eat up to 1 meter square of leaves in its lifetime. So that's in one season. Although this defoliation can look very harmful, many healthy trees can tolerate 1 or more years of defoliation. And some trees will even have a reflush of leaves later in the summer once the caterpillars are gone. So they'll actually flush out a second set of leaves. So unfortunately, this does take a lot of energy from the tree, and there's not much time left in the season to regain that energy through photosynthesis in these leaves. So it can be tough on the tree. A combination of stresses such as droughts, diseases, or other pests, or prolonged defoliation can ultimately lead to tree mortality. So if a tree is already unhealthy, it may not do as well against gypsy moth. Aside from the impact on trees, defoliation caused by gypsy moth can also have an impact on habitat. So defoliation reduces shade, and as we just discussed, some trees may die. So the caterpillar droppings, although it seems a bit weird to talk about, can also be quite a nuisance when there's an outbreak. and they can cover surfaces, and even sometimes to the point of it can sound like it's raining from the trees. So it's not great to think about, but it can be a nuisance. And the last thing I want to talk about is that European gypsy moth caterpillars do have long hairs that can cause skin irritation or allergic reactions for some people. So it is best to wear gloves if you have to handle them. And I wanted to point out in this picture, in case anyone's wondering why we have two different looking caterpillars side by side. As I said earlier, the mature caterpillar can be identified again by those 5 pairs of blue dots and then the 6 pairs of red dots. But this is actually a younger instar. So it's an earlier caterpillar, but it is still the gypsy moth caterpillar. So just keep in mind that the younger ones may not look how you expect them to. And the mature caterpillars are the easier ones to identify. Gypsy moth is not new to Ontario. Even though it is an invasive species, it has reached a state of naturalization. So this means that the population may have periodic, predictable outbreaks. And it is predicted that gypsy moth will have an outbreak every 7 to 10 years or so. However, in this area, we've not had a real outbreak since the early 90s. So we have had some major or localized increases here and there, but no outbreaks. So it is expected that there should be another outbreak at some point. And although we saw a small increase in defoliated area locally in 2019 and then a greater increase in 2020, we do not know whether this will be, if it'll result in kind of a local outbreak this year or next, or if it's just going to be another small increase, and then we won't see that outbreak ultimately. When we compare our area to other parts of Ontario, we certainly did not have near the amount of defoliation that other regions saw in 2020. So I wanted to go back to 2018 to see how this progressed provincially, and hopefully for those of you who aren't local to the Parry Sound region, this will also provide a little more context for you. Okay, so in this map, you can see that we have red areas and yellow areas. The red areas represent moderate to severe defoliation by gypsy moth, and then the yellow or orange areas represent just light defoliation. So in 2018, down in southern Ontario, kind of over by Brantford, Niagara Falls, we had some severe defoliation. And then in 2019, this expanded. And in 2019, you can even see we've got a few specks coming up near Midland and even up to Parry Sound. So it was expanding, but it was still mostly in the southern Ontario area. And then we had 2020. Last year, there was even more spread of defoliation in southern Ontario. It was particularly bad in areas as you get closer to eastern Ontario. So you can see some smaller areas of defoliation in Parry Sound District, and I will zoom in on these, but I just wanted to highlight that eastern Ontario and central eastern Ontario, that's where you really see the outbreak of gypsy moth in 2020. Okay, so now we're back to the French Severn Forest or the Parry Sound District, whatever you want to call it. In this map provided by the MNRF, 2019 gypsy moth defoliation is shown in blue. So if you look up to Parry Sound, right along here, you can see some speckles of small areas of defoliation from 2019. And the red areas are those from 2020. So most of the areas in the Parry Sound District that were defoliated in 2020 were south of Parry Sound, and a lot of them were along the Highway 400 corridor and also close to Georgian Bay. There were a few areas north of Parry Sound that were also mapped as defoliated. And in total in 2019, 177 hectares of defoliation was mapped. And then in 2020, 2,046 hectares of defoliation were mapped. So we definitely did see an increase, but as we saw in the last map, nowhere near that of other areas in the province. And this compared to over 544,000 hectares of area mapped province-wide. Thankfully, when it comes to gypsy moth, it's not all doom and gloom. There are natural controls, including a virus, a fungus, and predators that usually help to control populations of gypsy moth back to more manageable levels. And this usually happens 1 to 3 years after the outbreak. So there are parasites, wasps, and other predators that can feed on various stages of the gypsy moth, and this helps control it. There's also a fungus that causes widespread mortality of gypsy moths, which is great. It's from Japan, and it's called the Entomophaga mamega. It doesn't have a common name, so unfortunately, I'm sure people in this group are better at Latin than I am, but it was introduced to North America, and it has a greater effect when there is a cool, wet spring. And kind of going back to that trivia question, the dead caterpillars are brittle and dry, as seen in this photo on the left, and they eventually drop to the ground. So this is a sign of the fungus. And then we also have that virus that I was talking about. So that's the Nucleopolyhedrosis Virus, or MPV for short, which I prefer to call it. And it's a virus which only affects gypsy moth, and it kills the gypsy moth. It occurs naturally, but only in large populations. And as you can see in the photo on the right, caterpillars infected with the virus look like they are an inverted V. So the next thing I'm going to say is maybe a bit disgusting for people, so I'm just warning you. The virus liquefies the inside of the caterpillar. It leaks, other caterpillars crawl across it and become infected. I'm sorry. The other control mechanism we have is cold weather. So egg masses are cold tolerant, down to -20, -25 degrees Celsius in the winter. And so if we get temperatures that get below that, there can start to be egg mass mortality. However, egg masses below the snow have a greater likelihood of survival. So if we get quite a bit of snow, there may be some protection there. Just to note that when MNRF was doing surveys, they found larvae in Ontario that showed signs of that inverted V and that virus, as well as those that had been impacted by predators. So those can include the insects I talked about, or small mammals, or even birds. So while waiting for these natural mechanisms to control the population, there are some control options that folks may choose to use. So the first option is to scrape the egg masses off surfaces and kill them. As I said, these egg masses can be on a variety of surfaces, so feel free to scrape them off any of those. Egg masses can be found and removed from a variety of surfaces. And remember that the caterpillars will start emerging in May, so this needs to be done before that happens. So with a butter knife or a plastic paint scraper, or even I saw a video where someone used a winter windshield scraper. So feel free to use whatever you have. Scrape the egg masses off the surface or tree into a container. And you want to make sure that you're getting into the crevices and really trying to get as many of those egg masses as possible. Once you've done that, you're going to dump that container into a bucket of soapy water and leave it for 48 hours before disposing it to ensure that they have been destroyed. Unfortunately, caterpillars can still emerge from egg masses that fall to the ground, so they need to be put in soapy water to kill them. So even if when you're scraping, you get an egg mass on the ground, that doesn't mean that caterpillars can't emerge later on. And remember, each of these egg masses could have 100 to 1,000 eggs. So that's a lot of caterpillars to be dealing with later. So if you can remove them, that's great. Just gloves and eye protection are always a good idea when doing this. When you're scraping things off a tree, other things could spray out or get in your eyes or whatever. So just always want to be safe. Once the caterpillars actually emerge, you can remove them by hand picking them off the tree. Although this can be a little bit tedious if we're talking about quite a few that are all spread out. So you can make this easier by applying a sticky material banded around the tree, and this will kind of congregate the caterpillars, or you can apply a burlap wrap, a burlap band. This is done by wrapping a piece of burlap around the stem of a tree. You can see this in step 1. I've included a picture here from City of Toronto. And after you've secured that around the tree, you're going to tie a piece of twine or rope around the center of the burlap and drape the burlap cloth over the rope so there is an overhang. Caterpillars will seek shelter from predators and heat during the day, and they'll kind of crawl into that burlap and congregate there. And then in the afternoon, you can go ahead and check the burlap and pick off the caterpillars. Once you've picked off the caterpillars using any of these methods, you can put these in soapy water to destroy them. Because the caterpillars can cause irritation due to the hairs, just please remember to wear gloves when touching the caterpillars. And similar to these caterpillars, if you see the cocoons later on, you can also pick those off. Another option is pesticides. The most common is a biological pesticide called BTK. This is a naturally occurring bacteria found in soil that can be applied to foliage of the trees. So the caterpillars must ingest the pesticide in order for it to be effective. So even if it's sprayed onto the tree, it doesn't actually kill the caterpillar on impact. It has to eat the leaf that has that pesticide and ingest it. The timing of application is particularly important, and it must be done in the early stage of caterpillar development. So those early instars, when caterpillars are just beginning to feed on the foliage. Application timing is also really important to ensure that the BTK does not affect other Lepidoptera species, so other butterflies, moths. Affecting non-target species is obviously of common concern, particularly that other species could also be actively feeding. This risk is low since gypsy moth is treated at about 50% leaf out in a forest setting and generally not around water. So there are a few other species getting indirectly treated. Also, BTK breaks down on the leaves in about 48 hours, so it's not a long-lasting treatment. And although BTK can help reduce the population to more manageable levels, it does not eradicate all gypsy moth insects. So it can only be applied by a registered pesticide application company or by homeowners who have thoroughly and carefully read application instructions. For larger scale projects, only certified pesticide application companies should apply BTK. And aerial spray of BTK was organized in the GTA last year and will likely be done by landowners and organizations in some of the harder hit areas of the province this year. I just wanted to say as well, triazine, which I talked about with EAB, is also an option for protecting trees from gypsy moth. So I wanted to come back to this great diagram. I love it. It not only shows the life cycle of the gypsy moth, but also when different control measures are appropriate. So when using physical removal of gypsy moth, so either doing the picking caterpillars or scraping off the egg masses, there may be limits to how many trees you can treat. So in this case, similar to choosing trees to protect from EAB, you want to protect trees based on what is important to you. That could mean trees close to your home, unique species, trees with special habitat, trees that might be difficult to replace or remove, or any other region that might make them a priority for your management objectives. So in this diagram, you can see that destroying the egg masses can happen from September to April, and then burlap banding can happen from April to August, because burlap banding can actually also be used for the female adult moths. You can collect those as well. The biological pesticide, as you see here, has a limited window, as well as hand picking, because you're probably not hand picking when those caterpillars are quite small. Now for the big question, I guess, is forecasting. What is gypsy moth going to look like in 2021? We don't know exactly what triggers gypsy moth outbreaks. We know factors include weather, so they like hot, dry springs and summers, warm winters and deep snow, like I was talking about earlier, stress trees and periods of low defoliation, so there's fewer predators and diseases, as well as there's naive hosts. So we know that these are some of the factors that go into it, but we're not sure exactly what triggers it. MNRF did do egg mass surveys in Ontario to try to forecast defoliation in 2021. On this map, you can see the red kind of background color. It just shows the gypsy moth damage from 2020. So that's what we saw on an earlier map. And for the forecasting, you're actually looking for those red and yellow circles. So severe defoliation forecasted for 2021 is shown in those red circles. And there's only one yellow down east of Guelph that shows moderate defoliation forecast. Unfortunately, the MNRF did not do egg mass surveys for Parry Sound region. So the closest forecasts are in the Midhurst district near Midland and Orillia, and they both do have a severe forecast, but unfortunately we can't accurately predict whether the increases we've seen in recent years are going to lead to a local outbreak here, or whether we're just going to see kind of a smaller increase and not necessarily get that outbreak. It is important that you monitor those egg masses and caterpillars around you as that will give you a better sense of kind of what's going to happen in the future. The last thing I mentioned during every forest health discussion I have is please do not move firewood. This is a very common mechanism for spreading forest pests and diseases, so please buy wood close to your destination so you do not risk bringing any unwelcome hitchhikers. So thank you so much for listening today. I'll pass it back to Delana. I will say I'm not a gypsy moth or emerald ash borer expert. I will try to answer your question as best as possible, but if I can't, I really do welcome you to reach out to me, and I can definitely connect you with someone who can answer your question properly. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Margaret. That's wonderful information. I know myself, I learned a lot. And we do have a number of questions, open questions in the Q&A. Just a reminder, a few people might have missed this at the beginning, but if you could put your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom, that would be terrific. So, all right. Lots of questions coming in. So, Catherine, you've asked, is it possible to get a copy of the diagram for the gypsy moth? I'm assuming it was that life cycle diagram you're referring to. Margaret, is that something I can send out as an attachment to the email as well?
Absolutely. That diagram comes from the City of London. So I can send you the link to it, or we can include it in the email. Absolutely.
Elena, somebody's asked if you could speak up again, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know why that is happening today. All right. Jane has asked, oh, sorry, Jane, your question says naive host, but I think it's native host that we were looking for. Is that right, Margaret?
No, I was actually saying naive hosts because after a tree has been kind of impacted, they do kind of have these natural defenses that can make it a bit tougher to feed on the tree. And so having these naive hosts that haven't been impacted following a period of lower populations can be beneficial to an outbreak.
And I think you addressed this, Margaret, but Nicole's question was, what trees do the caterpillars prefer? Maybe you just want to remind us.
Absolutely. So gypsy moth tends to prefer red oak, but will feast on many, many species: maple, birch, pine, a lot of different hardwoods and conifers. And the list is, they technically have hosts over 300 plant species.
Margaret, another question from Henry regarding the sticky traps, asking where to place it. And there was another question about birds getting stuck on the sticky traps as well, if you've heard of that happening.
I haven't heard of that happening, but I am less familiar with the sticky traps. We'll certainly send out in the follow-up email some more information on kind of how to apply these properly. The sticky, my understanding is the sticky traps you want to put on the main trunk of the tree, and that's kind of just to stop them from going up and down. Up and down and kind of congregating them there. In terms of specific materials, I think that would probably be best answered in the follow-up email with some more resources, just so that you have kind of the step-by-step on those sticky wraps.
Okay, lots of questions coming in. Is BTK effective on coniferous trees? Margaret? Oh,
to be honest, I'm not 100% sure about that. I would imagine it is, just because if the caterpillars ingest it, it doesn't really matter where it's coming from. But I'm not as familiar with its use on conifers. So I can definitely follow up with that.
Okay. If you are having your property sprayed with BTK and the first insar, do you need to band the trees as well?
I'm sorry, I'm just trying to think through this. So BTK spray will not kill the entire population. So if you wanted to have absolute complete control, you could potentially also wrap them or use the other physical removal techniques. I would think talking to a BTK applicator would be your best bet to know exactly how much of the population would be left behind and whether it's almost necessary. Because if there's only a few caterpillars, the defoliation probably isn't going to have a very big impact on the tree. But if you are seeing more caterpillars left behind, then burlap wrapping could be an option to kind of reduce that population that much more.
Okay. And this was on the diagram you showed us, but the question is, how soon should we start wrapping trees for gypsy moth?
Yeah, so you want to start wrapping them when those you want to start wrapping them when the caterpillars are at a size where you could take them off realistically. So at those earlier stages, when the caterpillars are really small, it would be possible to burlap wrap, put those wraps around, but those are going to be very small caterpillars that you're trying to collect and get off. So here, I'll bring that back up. So it does show that you can do it right from the beginning, but it is going to be that much more difficult on those smaller caterpillars to remove them just because they are quite small.
Awesome. And just for those that were interested in more information about the sticky traps, there's some comments coming in about birds, hearing about birds that have got stuck on them before. Just so we'll note that. It does seem like something that could pretty easily happen. Peter's asked, is there a reason for cutting down affected ash trees other than safety?
So you might also do it if you're trying to if you're working with a woodlot or something and you have trees impacted by emerald ash borer, you may want to encourage the growth of other species that aren't going to be impacted by emerald ash borer. So if you've got a fairly large component of emerald ash borer, you may want to be taking some of that out in order to encourage kind of more diversity and other species to grow up. Just because we do know that ash are being infected by this emerald ash borer, and there may be other species that are going to be more successful long term.
Would the spray affect the sugar maples not the spray. Would the defoliation affect sugar maples syrup production in the following year?
Yeah, I would imagine it could, because it is using using the resources of the tree, and it's taking energy to produce that reflush of leaves. In terms of the specific impacts and how much of an impact it has, I don't know that exactly, whether it's kind of a small impact, and also it's going to depend on how defoliated the tree is and how healthy it was to begin with, but I'm not sure of the specific implications.
Great. So we still have a ton of questions coming in, just so everyone knows. We'll probably be a couple more minutes answering them, but the bulk of the presentation is over if you do need to leave us. Andy Matilka, hello. He's asked, does the ash borer remain underneath the bark or does it penetrate further?
Sorry, Delana, can you repeat that?
Yeah, Andy Matilka's asked, does the ash borer remain underneath the bark or does it penetrate further into the tree?
So they burrow into the inner bark in the cambial layer. So it does go into the tissue of the tree, and then it excavates a tiny chamber that it stays inside in the winter. So it does go below the bark, and that's where you see, I wonder if I can bring it up. Here, yeah. So this is underneath. This is kind of with the bark removed. So it is burrowing into the tree itself.
Okay, for trees that were hit hard last year from gypsy moths, is there anything that can be done to try and promote tree health so that they are able to survive this year's outbreak?
Yeah, so I know one of the things I've seen and is if you've got some drier periods, definitely if we're not talking large scale woodlots, things like watering your trees just to kind of get them through drier periods. Just mostly if they've got other stresses impacting them, they're going to have a harder time dealing with gypsy moth. So if drought is something they're dealing with, giving them a bit of water, just getting them through those other stresses to help them deal with it.
Okay, and another question, are there any native caterpillar species that would be easily confused with the gypsy moth caterpillar? I'm thinking back to that first slide we had with the pop quiz, what those other species were.
As far as I know from the pairs of dots, I think that's unique to gypsy moth, but I will say you do need to look closely because if you're standing back and you just see some blue, you could think it's the forest tent caterpillar. It does have some blue, but it has those keyhole kind of white marks on its back as well. So I would say if you're close enough and can look at it, and also if it's mature, because as I showed, those younger instars can look different and don't really look like that mature caterpillar. And when they're quite small, it's going to be hard to identify them. So I'm not aware of any that at a mature stage look really close to gypsy moth, but I mean, unless you're really up close taking a look at it, it might be difficult to tell, like if they're up in the tree, like up in the foliage of the tree, it might be hard to figure out exactly what it is.
Okay. And what's your recommendation for the amount of soap to make our soapy water for the caterpillars and the egg masses when we're removing them? How soapy does it need to be?
I will include that with the step-by-step, but when I looked at various places that recommended how to do it, it was generally just soapy water. There didn't seem to be a lot of specifications in terms of how soapy to make it. So I think as long as you've got some bubbles going and that you're submerging the egg masses or caterpillars in it, I think you're going to be okay. But when we send those follow-up resources that include how to do the burlap wrapping and also how to take off the egg masses, I can double check that there's not a minimum amount to ensure that you're destroying it.
So there's a comment, not so much a question, from Jonathan, and he says, I've been applying dormant oil applications to the egg masses. It seems to be quite effective. Please comment. So Jonathan, I think you're just smothering those egg masses. And Margaret, I don't know if there'd be any more to that.
Yeah, I mean, people definitely have their own techniques. In what I've seen, they haven't specifically recommended dormant oil, but that doesn't mean it doesn't work. The only thing I would say is if you're choosing to apply something, just make sure it is kind of meant for what you're using it for and that it is appropriate to put on trees or use for gypsy moth. Yeah, the main recommendations are kind of some of those that I mentioned in the presentation.
So we're getting some questions too about other types of forest pests. In the Point of Barrel Islands, they've observed defoliation from the red-humped oakworm. Are you aware of other reports of this pest in the Parry Sound area?
No, I can't say I am. Okay. But that doesn't mean there's not. I'm not familiar with it.
And you might have spoken to this too, Margaret. Do you know of any long-term projections or estimates of the consequences of gypsy moth and or emerald ash borer infestations?
So for gypsy moth, long-term, it's a naturalized species. So we see these cyclic outbreaks, and we also have these kind of we have these natural control mechanisms. So long-term, we probably will expect to see more kind of those cyclic outbreaks going forward. There is the unknown of what climate change will result in and how that will impact things. If we are getting warmer winters and warmer springs, that may have an impact on some of the outbreaks, as well as the natural controls. But also if we get extreme temperatures, so if we get some really cold winters, that may have some impacts too. So the projections are kind of unknown, but gypsy moth is expected to continue to cycle and have kind of outbreaks on a more regular basis.
Great. All right. Still lots of questions coming in. So emerald ash borer, is there a chance that it would feed off or transfer to other types of trees? And if they kill the majority of ash trees, would the ash borer also die off?
Yeah, so my understanding is that emerald ash borer only impacts ash trees. I haven't heard of it impacting other species. If all the ash are gone in an area, it's unlikely that there'll be much of a population of emerald ash borer there. But what we've seen right now is emerald ash borer just seems to be spreading. So we haven't seen, even though cities are treating or cutting a lot of the trees, we haven't seen they've gotten to a point where they're good and emerald ash borer is no longer spreading.
And is it true that emerald ash borer affects some species of ash more than others?
Yes, this is true. I do remember, sorry about this. I do remember reading about the different species that it impacts more. I don't have that offhand. Again, I'll follow up with that in the email and include it in some of the answers we have.
Great. So Ian has commented about hanging traps containing the pheromone to capture the males. He used plastic bottles with soapy water in the bottom and caught lots. Did you want to comment on that, or maybe David, regarding the pheromones?
They do use pheromone trapping, certainly. And it is in I can go back to my great diagram. It is in that diagram. They do use pheromone trapping to predict populations, but I'm not as familiar with pheromone trapping for actually trying to control the population. I don't know if David is.
Yeah, I don't have anything more to add. I'm trying to deal with some of these questions as well. These are great questions from you guys.
Great. So Marilyn's asked about spraying the trees with soapy water. Is this recommended or futile? And I'm going to go ahead and say it's probably futile. We probably want the caterpillars to be placed in the soapy water. Is that true, Margaret?
Yeah, that would be my understanding, just because depending on the recommendations you read, some of them do say you want 48 hours in that soapy water. And that's going to be hard to achieve by just putting the soapy water on the tree. And that's why it's also really important that when you are scraping those egg masses, you want to get into the crevices and try to get as many as you can off, just to prevent kind of as many residual egg masses as possible.
Okay, and I think you touched on this too, Margaret, but oh, no, David's answering that one. That's all right. Henry's asked, do you recommend any fertilizers for trees? We're getting away from some of the pests here into some other questions. Any fertilizers?
Not specifically. I understand, I wonder if this is related to kind of trying to boost your trees to kind of fight against when we do have these pests. And that's certainly an option in terms of when it's necessary or the specific ones to use. I don't have a great answer for you, but if you are looking at specific trees and you're wanting to protect specific trees and looking for options that might boost your tree, that might be the time to consult an arborist, and they can probably give you better recommendations on individual trees and how to deal with them.
Okay, unless there's any more questions, I think we've sort of addressed everything. I'm just double checking. I don't think we missed any in the chat.
I also just want to mention that like I said, I'm not an expert in, emerald ash borer and gypsy moth. I just want to share as much information as possible. But if you have follow-up questions that in an hour from now or a day from now, you think about and you go, oh, shoot, I wish I would have asked that question. When Delana sends out that follow-up email, I'll make sure she includes my email, and feel free to reach out to me. And if I can't answer your question, I can certainly track down someone who can answer it. Because I want to make sure that even if you don't think about it right now, you do get your answers later on.
And Elizabeth just asked if the Biosphere or MNR have a brochure that we give out. We did put together, David and Margaret did actually, a Gypsy Moth information package. And so we're going to be emailing that out in the follow-up, but it also is available on our website too. So you can go back and reference it there anytime. All right, and I don't see any new questions coming in. So I just want to say a huge thank you to Margaret so much, so appreciated for your time. I learned a lot. This is really excellent. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, everyone, have a great day and take care.